My name is Randi Eisenberg, and I'm a graduate student at Queens College in the Master of Arts in Teaching program. For my special education course, I was required to observe an inclusion classroom in which students with special needs are educated in the general education setting. I observed a 4th grade inclusion classroom in Plainview, New York at Pasadena Elementary School. You are about to embark on my journey observing this classroom. Let's begin.
Pasadena is one of the elementary schools within the Plainview-Obeth-Page Central School District on Long Island. It is a public school instructing approximately 327 students in grades 1 through 4. There are 17 classrooms in this one-story building with a total of 30 staff members. This is the 4th grade inclusion classroom I observed. The class has a total of 24 students, with 4 having IEPs. There are 2 teachers in this classroom. Mrs. Patanjo is the general education teacher, and Mrs. Winter is the special education teacher. They work collaboratively to ensure that the students with special needs are getting the proper instruction. Here are the 3 main areas I will now discuss that were notable throughout my observations. Various strategies were used within these areas to help promote opportunities for the students with high-incidence disabilities in the inclusion class.
The first area I will look at is instructional grouping, which is when students are placed into smaller groups for teaching purposes. Often, groups are assigned based on academic ability, and the tasks or expectations of student performance may differ. The teachers in the classroom I observed use instructional grouping for reading and math lessons to help differentiate the instruction for the students with high-incidence disabilities.
Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter use the co-teaching strategy of station teaching to motivate students to learn in instructional groups for reading lessons. Station teaching is when both teachers instruct through a variety of small group learning centers. At the stations with the teacher, the instruction is tailored to meet the student's needs depending on reading ability. Mrs. Winter's reading station is the same group of students each day who are at the lowest reading level. 2 of them have high incidence disabilities. This is where their station is located in the class. During their instructional group time, Mrs. Winter provides the students with accommodations to benefit their learning. For example, she goes in depth into word study principles like the one in this picture, uses books on lower reading levels, and spends more time on vocabulary and the main ideas of the books. The rest of the class is divided into small groups that rotate seeing Mrs. Patanjo at this station. Depending on reading abilities, Mrs. Patanjo will decide what books are appropriate, how the discussion will go, and what activities they could do after the reading. The groups that don't meet with either of the teachers at a station will engage in independent reading. For math lessons, Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter use the co-teaching strategy of alternative teaching to group the students with high-incidence disabilities together to receive specialized instruction. Alternative teaching is when one teacher interacts with a larger group while the other teacher works with a smaller group. The content of the instruction is dependent upon the learning needs of the students. Here is an example of how one teacher is interacting with a larger group of students while the other teacher is instructing a smaller group. In a math lesson I observed, Mrs. Winter taught the smaller group and differentiated the instruction to meet the students' needs. Mrs. Winter's lesson included breaking down the complex math concept into less overwhelming tasks. She spent more time explaining the concept, used smaller numbers, and asked the students to complete fewer math problems. There were different work expectations for these students because it took longer to grasp the content. According to my interview with Mrs. Winter, she said, "The kids love working in groups because it's more one-on-one. Some kids flourish when the ratio of teacher to student is smaller. Instructional grouping does benefit the students in this inclusion class, especially those with high-incidence disabilities."
The next area I will explore is peer support. Peer support arrangements are promising for students with special needs because it helps promote their access to learning experiences and expand their opportunities to establish new relationships. In the inclusion classroom I observed, the students with high-incidence disabilities got support from their peers in various ways.
The seating arrangement in the inclusion class fosters an environment for peer supports. Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter placed the students with high-incidence disabilities next to students that could serve as models or support systems during whole class instructional activities. For example, during a social studies lesson, the students with high-incidence disabilities followed along with their peers as the content was being read aloud from a chapter in their textbook. Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter also use a peer support strategy when practicing a skill and when doing group projects. The students with high-incidence disabilities are paired with students who can assist them in participating more fully in the learning environment. For example, I observed a lesson on character traits in which a book on Harriet Tubman was read. Peer supports were then used for a group assignment to guide the students with high incidence disabilities in practicing the skill of finding character traits and providing evidence to support their choices. I think peer tutoring could be another strategy implemented to help the students with high incidence disabilities succeed. In this strategy, one student serves as a teacher or monitor of another student who needs additional instruction or practice. This would be effective in this classroom to keep the students with special needs on track.
The last area I will examine is the fostering of social relationships within instructional activities. Building positive and trusting relationships is critical for effective learning to occur, especially for students with high incidence disabilities. Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter foster these relationships by encouraging the students to interact during instructional activities.
When students are in instructional groups, they are given the opportunity to interact and feed off each other. The students with high incidence disabilities take in what each group member has to say and internalize it to help build an understanding of the content. Sharing written work is another way Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter help foster social relationships. Each week, the students get to share an entry from their writers' notebooks. By sharing personal stories and opinions, the students are opening up and learning to individualize one another. Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter also foster social relationships by utilizing teamwork. When preparing for a test or quiz, they sometimes play a review game that requires the students to work with their table or row to answer the questions. For example, I observed the class playing Jeopardy to review for a social studies test on U.S. landforms and regions. The students built on their relationships with classmates as they worked together to come up with the correct answers to the Jeopardy questions. Here is a recap of our look into inclusion at Pasadena Elementary School. I explored how instructional grouping, peer supports, and the fostering of social relationships were evident throughout my observations. The various strategies used by Mrs. Patanjo and Mrs. Winter within these key areas are beneficial in creating opportunities for the students with high incidence disabilities to succeed in the general education setting.
Thank you for taking this journey with me about inclusion here at Pasadena Elementary School. I hope you learned a lot from my observations. Bye now.
All in this together, and it shows when we stand.